Hello, folks on Zoom. It's running a little behind today, so thanks for your patience. I'm going to go ahead and share screen and get going as soon as I finish taking attendance here. All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. Again, I enjoy going to speaker events. I don't like when they make me like real. Okay, reminder, exam 2 is due today. It's the same format as exam 1. You do it on Blackboard. I know probably about half of you have turned it in already, but I was waiting to grade it till everybody had it in because it's easier for me to sort of get in the zone. Yes. Correct. Yep. I think it says like 11:59, but it also won't shut off. So if you get it in at 12:05, it's fine. Right. I fully recognize Blackboard is problematic sometimes, right? In terms of taking things, not taking things along those lines. So I want to acknowledge that. The other thing to be starting to think about is meeting up with your groups. That's virtually, in person, over text. And start thinking of an outline for your presentation, how you want to do your presentation, things along those lines. These captions up and going because they're just a little bit more accurate. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the media project paper. It's technically due a week from today. If you need more time, you don't even have to ask, just give yourself more time and get it in. So again, that's one scholarly article, one media representation, so a TV show, movie, YouTube channel, on a TikTok channel, right, whatever you want to use of that same disorder, and you compare and contrast. Alrighty, okay, so we're going to talk about eating disorders, and this is my area of specialty. This is what I do research on. This is where I focused my practice when I was in graduate school. And so I have experience not as much with folks with severe anorexia nervosa, simply because they would have been inpatient hospitalized. I only ever worked in outpatient settings. But I do have experience with folks with sort of, I don't want to say lower grade, but like anorexia, not so where they needed to be hospitalized. A lot of folks with bulimia nervosa, a lot of folks with binge eating disorder, and the full spectrum of, in terms of people who were underweight to people who were overweight, everything in between. And so that's the first thing I want to start by saying that I think is a misconception about this type of disorder, is that this is not limited to skinny teenage white girls. And I think that's the portrayal that we see. Okay, so this crosses genders, this crosses races, this crosses ages, and this crosses body types for sure. And in fact, there's this type of anorexia, ironically called atypical anorexia, which is basically you have all the symptoms of anorexia nervosa, but you're not underweight. And that's actually the reason I say it's ironically named is because it's much more common than traditional anorexia nervosa. So just fully acknowledging that the picture we get from media is not always accurate. Alrighty, so these are unfortunately one of the most common problems, particularly among young females in Western cultures, but again, they don't discriminate by gender. So we see men with the traditional eating disorders, we see trans and non-binary individuals with them as well. If you look at the DSM-5 and you look at the prevalence rate, it lists for eating disorders, it's pretty low. It says, it's like 0.4% for anorexia, like 2 to 3% of the population for bulimia. And traditional data from the DSM-5 also report that more than 90% of people with an eating disorder are women. However, that research is very out of date. The research reported in the DSM-5 is strictly based on who comes in for treatment, which we know more women come in for. But in fact, more recent research says that at least a quarter up to maybe a third of patients are male or non-binary. And that when we look at just research studies, whether we're doing interviews to diagnose people with symptoms, or there are questionnaires you can use to diagnose, what we see is 10 to 15% of people meeting criteria for eating disorders. And in fact, my own research, particularly when I've done it, this is not a bad problem, and I don't want anyone to think I'm saying it is, but at Virginia Wesleyan, I just don't find that many people with eating disorders. Like, that's great. As a cosmic whole, it just means I'm not going to intricately study people with disordered eating, right? But other places, my undergrad institution, my graduate institution, when I collect this data, I find up to a third of my sample meets criteria for an eating disorder. And part of that is a bias, right? That if you see if it's about eating, people who are interested in it because they have disordered eating might be more likely to take it. And I think part of it is reflecting that we're missing a lot of these folks, that they're just never coming in for help. About a third of adolescent females use extreme forms of weight control. So these are things like purging. Purging is typically vomiting to lose weight, using diet pills. Diet pills are very scary because unless they're prescription, they're not regulated by the FDA. So they're considered a supplement. And so a lot of them are essentially meth. Like, I don't know if anyone remembers the Hydroxycut commercials from maybe 15 years ago. They were like, weight loss, energy to burn. It's because you're taking meth, essentially. A lot of my research focuses on body dissatisfaction, or the larger umbrella term of body image disturbance. So for college women in particular, about 61% engaged in some form of disordered eating behaviors, again, whether that was fasting, using diet pills, purging, things along those lines. And more than 80% experienced body dissatisfaction. If you remember from our BDD slide a few years ago, feels like years ago, it's been 4 years now, a few days ago, geez. That 99% of women surveyed would like to change something about their appearance, but it was like 94 or 93% of men, right? So again, here are some of the statistics I found with the samples that I collected. So again, at Kent State, which is where I did my graduate work, 28 and 33% of the sample meeting criteria for an eating disorder. And then this study from BW, at that time C, now BWU, and Kenyon College, again, about 32%. So again, a lot of these folks are not coming in, and so we're missing them that way. And a lot of people just sort of suffer in silence and don't even realize what they're doing is an eating disorder, if that makes sense. All right, so let's start with anorexia nervosa. So this is, again, I think what people stereotypically think of when they think of eating disorders. And so it's restricted net intake of nourishment, and that leads to a significantly low body weight. And again, there's this other diagnosis, atypical anorexia, where it has all these criteria, but not the low body weight. And it's just as damaging. All the stuff we're going to talk about on the coming slides in terms of the side effects happen then too. But unfortunately, and this is like my own bias from my years of research and treating people, so I'm just going to put this out there that a lot of people don't agree with me. When we have someone who engages in certain behaviors and they're underweight, we call it an eating disorder. When we have someone who engages in the same behaviors and they're overweight, we congratulate them, right? And in fact, sometimes we prescribe disordered eating to overweight or obese people. And that's really problematic because we can be very damaging to their health. Folks with anorexia will have an intense fear of gaining weight. And again, for traditional anorexia nervosa, they will be significantly underweight, or they'll engage in persistent behavior that interferes with weight gain. And we see this particularly in adolescence, where it's like they might not necessarily start off underweight, but they like won't meet milestones because they're trying to avoid gaining weight. They have a disturbed body perception, and I would say this is really a cardinal feature of both body dysmorphic disorder and eating disorders, where they will see their body differently than those around them do. So for example, one of my clients I worked with who had anorexia nervosa, not severe enough to go inpatient. One of the activities we would do with these patients is we would have them, we give them a piece of, whichever surface. Here it would be a piece of chalk. I had a whiteboard, so I gave her a whiteboard marker. And I said, okay, estimate for me, pretend you're looking in a mirror, estimate for me the size of your shoulders, your waist, and your hips. And so she kind of hemmed and hawed. And then what I did is I flipped her around and I actually put marks where she works. And the fascinating thing to me with this particular client is she was spot on with her shoulders. Her shoulders like maybe half an inch, if that apart from where her shoulders were. She overestimated her waist and her hips by probably 2 inches on each side. She literally saw herself as that much bigger than she actually was and did not believe me, even though she felt me marked next to her, that's how small she actually was. They will also have an undue influence of weight or shape on how they evaluate themselves. So they could be getting straight A's, be, class president, doing great on the sports field, but if they feel like their body doesn't look right, they think of themselves as a horrible person. And they'll have persistent denial of the seriousness of their current low weight. They'll be like, what are you talking about? No, it's not that bad. So these are some of and actually, hang on just a sec. I'm trying to remember. I know I put in some videos. Yeah, I'm wondering if I just linked it here. Give me a second. Or if this is one of our songs. The things I do on my lunch breaks when I want to make sure y'all. Yes, this is just one of our songs here. I just wanna get away with you. So that's a song about someone with an eating disorder. I guess I didn't put in the video about someone with AN, but I have some other videos later. But I am going to talk about some of the medical consequences of anorexia. And I'm going to start with the bottom, because this is the statistic that often surprises people. Anorexia nervosa is the psychological disorder with the highest mortality rate. People typically think it's depression or maybe one of the personality disorders, but it's AN. And that's for a couple reasons. One is that they also have an elevated risk of suicide. But the second is all of these medical complications can lead to death as well. So they'll get cardiovascular complications. And in fact, one of the ways I got really interested in studying eating disorders and body image was when I was in college. I think I was probably 20, 21. I read an article about a 22-year-old ballet dancer. So someone you would imagine would be very physically fit, who died of a heart attack because she had anorexia nervosa, 22 years old. And this is what really got me thinking about, like, how does this happen to people? They'll also have low blood pressure, low body temperature, lowered metabolism. People don't get this. They're like, what do you mean? If you don't eat anything, it's really good for your body. No, your body wants to wring as many calories as it can from things, so it will slow your metabolism way down. Your body will also start to do things like it'll eat all your fat first, and then it'll start eating your muscles, and it'll start eating your brain. So there's actually studies where people with anorexia in particular have decreased brain volume. Now, the nice thing is when they recover, it comes back. But clearly not great. Fluid and electrolyte complications. I had clients who would not drink because when they drank water, because they ate and consumed so frequently, they could see the water in their stomach. that's not great. Your body needs to be hydrated, right? Dental problems in particular, some people with anorexia will purge their food. And so the stomach acid will wreak havoc on your tooth enamel. But also sometimes just from not eating enough, malnutrition, right, will affect your tooth health as well. Gastrointestinal complications, dehydration. Lanugo is so interesting. So these are small downy hairs we actually have on the typically hairless parts of our bodies when we're born. They are meant to keep us warm, and then we typically lose them as we gain enough body fat to keep ourselves warm. People with anorexia nervosa will grow them again in an effort to keep their body warm. If they are a person who menstruates, their menstrual cycle might stop. And in fact, this used to be a criteria for anorexia, but they've done away with this. I mean, for one thing, it always had to exclude people in male bodies, right? But the second reason is so many women are on birth control now that they still get what looks like a period even when they're very low weight. So this is not really an accurate symptom. But certainly that could potentially cause damage to your reproductive system. And some of these folks, again, as teens in their 20s, will develop osteoporosis, osteoarthritis because of the lack of nutrition. So there are subtypes within the DSM-5. So there's restricting, which again is what we typically think of when we think of anorexia nervosa. These are the people who drastically restrict their food intake. They might only eat a couple hundred calories a day. That's not enough to sustain anyone's body. And then binge purging. Now, the really interesting thing is we're going to talk about bulimia in a minute. And bulimia, the purges are very objectively large, typically. For people with anorexia nervosa, a binge might be eating the whole sandwich instead of only half the sandwich. But to them, it feels like they're out of control. And they will either go excessively exercise, throw up, some combination of there to try to get rid of that. And largely, honestly, because it's difficult to maintain restricting type, a lot of people will move to the binge purge type. Eating disorders are very difficult on your body. And so not only we know that binging serves some emotion regulation purposes if you're feeling really bad. I mean, let's think of a stereotypical romantic comedies, right? If someone's broken up with, they're like in the bed and Jerry's, right? We could have like endorse that. If you're feeling bad, do a little binge. But people with eating disorders, this becomes one of the only ways that kind of modulate their emotions. But it also becomes linked to you just get hungry, right? I mean, this is the irony of the term anorexia nervosa. Anorexia technically means loss of appetite. These folks don't lose their appetites. They know the hunger, they feel the hunger, they just deny themselves. All right, so for bulimia nervosa, what we see here are the binges and purges, and in this case, the binges are a large amount of food in a short amount of time with a sense of loss of control. Binges can be 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 calories. So these are very large amounts of food. Now, the really interesting thing, this is like a little side note, is like a lot of us are sort of like, whoa, when we think about that. But then there are times when consuming that amount of calories is like culturally appropriate, right? Like I think about holiday meals, or I had a student once who was from the same town Michael Phelps was from. And she said the night before a meet, he'd come in and eat like 10,000 calories worth of food in his restaurant, but just to fuel his body, right? So it's sort of interesting to think about like when is it pathological and when is it culturally acceptable? And then they'll purge in some way. And so that could be forcing themselves to vomit after they eat, using laxatives, which if you're not familiar with those, they basically give you diarrhea. Diuretics are water pills, so eventually try to get rid of your water weight, fasting, and excessive exercise. Again, this is me, not anything to do with current diets, fads, whatever. But this is one of the reasons why like intermittent fasting is sort of funny to me, because people are like, oh, it helps your metabolism. Like, no, we know from eating disorder research that it's just gonna slow down when you fast for that long. And like some people, not everyone, but some people who get into intermittent fasting almost have like eating disorder like symptoms. So there's a really interesting show on Disney Plus called Limitless, I think. It's Chris Hemsworth who plays Thor. And he goes around and tries some extreme things your body can do. So he tries a like 3-day fast. And the guy who does it with him when they're eating at the end of it is like, don't you feel guilty? And Hemsworth's like, no, like how do I feel? But like to me, at the eating disorder research, I'm like, oh, there's something maybe not healthy about the way this guy did it, but it was fine for Hemsworth, right? So it's just something, again, very similar to when is binging culturally sanctioned. You have to figure out what works for you and what's not healthy for you. You have to do this at least once a week for 3 months. And again, your self-evaluation is unduly influenced by weight and shape. And people with bulimia nervosa are typically at or above normal weight. And there's a whole host of reasons for this, because one of the biggest one is that these methods of purging are often not effective at removing the calories. Most people with bulimia are actually within 10% of the ideal body weight. And they're sometimes a little bit overweight beforehand, but they believe themselves to be disproportioned and are very affected emotionally by that idea. Now, binges range. Some people will only binge that criteria once per week. Some people will do, up to 40 times a week, multiple times per day. And again, whenever they're binging, they're also purging, so wreaking havoc on their body. Binges are often carried out in secret. I think they've shown some of these folks on My Strange Addiction, like they will plan the binge for when no one else is around, or they'll eat in their car and like throw the packages out in like a dumpster somewhere so no one sees them. But oftentimes they're just, sort of doing it when no one else is home, and sort of doing it almost like guiltfully, but at the same time, it's like they get a high. People who binge will describe it as like not even realizing how much they're eating while they do it. They eat massive amounts of food rapidly with very little chewing. And what they tend to binge on, again, it's going to vary drastically from person to person, but it tends to be things that our bodies biologically crave. So fats and starches. So for example, I had a client who's been is included a whole bunch of things, but also like a whole stick of butter because her body was craving fats. One of the interesting challenges about being an eating disorder researcher is you have to learn, or especially when I was treating folks, is you have to learn not to react with disgust to these things. You don't want to judge those folks, right? I mean, people will sometimes eat things out of the garbage, things along those lines. You have to keep a straight face, be supportive, try to help them change their behaviors. Another client would eat entire boxes of cereal because what she would crave would be carbs. Binges are usually preceded by feelings of tension or powerlessness, and then they feel like they have some power, even though then they feel like a sense of loss of control. Eating disorders in general, people who have them tend to feel like they're in power, in control over what's going on in their lives, when in fact, unfortunately, they're not. The disorder takes over and controls them, essentially. And although the binge itself may be pleasurable, it's usually followed by extreme feelings of extreme self-blame, guilt, depression, and fears of weight gain, and particularly of like other people discovering that they're binging and the shame associated with that. I know I have a video about binging on my drive here, so I'm just going to find it real quick because I think it helps to hear someone who does it talk about it.
It's called
Ooh,
bulimia,
really
a
loud.
disease this woman has suffered for the past 3 years.
I know that one day I'm going to wake up, though, and something's going to go wrong. And it may be too late, or I may be able to do something about it. But I just don't want to have to keep doing it until that happens.
So you think you'll survive this?
Sometimes, yes, I do, and sometimes I'm real realistic, and I think if I keep this up at the intensity and the rate that I'm doing it now, I probably won't be around next year.
24 years old, single, a part-time sales clerk in a department store. She's been starving and dieting, binging and vomiting since she was 15 years old. Today, her weight is 95 pounds.
And so this is a pattern that we'll see that people will have this for years and hide it and not seek treatment, which again is why some of those stats are off. I saw Christopher Fairburn, who's like this amazing researcher and therapist, do a workshop once, and he talked about how he saw a nun for therapy who had been having an eating disorder, binging and purging in secret in the convent for 20 years, and none of her fellow nuns knew it because she hid it so well.
3 times she's been hospitalized. Once 2 police officers came with a court order, took her to a treatment facility where she was committed for 5 months against her will.
My doctor classified me as psychotic.
And this is unfortunately pretty common. Folks with eating disorders often don't believe there's anything wrong with them or think they need help, so they'll often be put into treatment against their will, and then it's not that effective. I've heard horror stories. One of the things they do if you're very, very thin is they'll feed you through a tube put directly into your stomach, and I've heard horror stories of women or girls actually learning to push food back out through that tube when no one's around. So they find ways.
I spent maybe 6 to 10 hours a day binging and vomiting.
Eating
Even though I
tremendously?
worked.
Eating volumes? And
Volumes, going from restaurant to restaurant, which is something I do. I guess it's different than most bulimics because I unfortunately have the funds.
and then throwing it all up.
Throwing every bit of it up. I wouldn't keep anything in me, not even a grape.
We're gonna talk in a minute how she's probably wrong about that. Vomiting is not actually that effective for getting everything out.
You know, I just felt intense guilt.
Day after day?
Sometimes she stays home and eats continuously for 2 hours. This is one such meal: a half-gallon of milk, a bottle of Pepsi, a quart of eggnog, 3 sandwiches, potato chips, tuna salad, ice cream, cinnamon rolls, a bottle of wine, cupcakes, cereal, a can of soup, a hamburger, a baked potato, and lasagna. 2 hours from now, in her words, she will look pregnant and weigh 10 pounds more than she does right now. This is hard to believe, this obsession. And I wondered how it all began. What was her first experience with bulimia, her first night? It came almost 3 years ago, right after the end of a diet.
I had eaten so much at one point, I think we went to the Boston Sea Party, and I just stuffed myself. And I was so miserable and so uncomfortable that in the middle of the night I just couldn't sleep. I couldn't lie down in any position without just being, you know, in such a painful state. So I went to the bathroom and I just literally voluntarily forced myself to get sick. And I felt so relieved.
That was the first time.
I think that was the first time.
How'd you feel?
Yeah, and that happens where people either do it by accident or they read about it somewhere and like, oh, that's a thing I could do, which obviously isn't that great. Let me see real quick, this one about anorexia, if it's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, okay, so this is about Isabella Caro. You may or may not be familiar with her. She's unfortunately passed away from anorexia. She was a very, very thin model who eventually at the end of her life realized she was very ill from an eating disorder and used her body to promote how problematic eating disorders are. So I will tell you that the images of her are disturbing because of how thin she is.
You remember the picture. The shocking, haunting gaze of an anorexic. Hard to look at, hard to look away from. Isabelle Carreau was the model. She told us she has no regrets. She posed for the campaign.
I've been anorexic since I was 13. I said if I can put my years of suffering to use, then it would not have been pointless. I hope the message got through. I know there has been a lot of criticism because it's a shocking photo, and I wanted to shock.
And so the way she's dressed is very typical of people with anorexia nervosa. They're often in a lot of layers to try to stay warm because they just don't have body fat to help regulate their temperature.
It's really a warning that this is a serious illness.
But it's too painful now for Isabelle to see that picture.
I say to myself, that's horrible, horrible.
Are you worried that young girls suffering from anorexia might see that picture of you and think, I have to lose more, I have to lose more. Look at how beautiful she is like that. I must lose more.
I don't think so. I hope not. To see my tailbone like an open wound, I show myself as I am. I'm not beautiful, my hair is ruined, and I know I will never have long hair again. I've lost several teeth, my skin is dry, my breasts have fallen.
At 5 feet and now 66 pounds, 25-year-old Isabelle has a body mass index under 14. The lowest healthy adult BMI is 18.5.
And so one thing I'll say real quick, that's enough of that one survey. One thing I'll say real quick is that BMI is still largely used in the eating disorder world as sort of a marker to compare sort of how people are doing. It's just a ratio of weight to height. It's very problematic because it doesn't take into account things like muscle. So a lot of athletes actually register in overweight to obese because muscle weighs more than fat, even though they're like the healthiest people, right? The other problem with BMI, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but just to give you all a little history, is that its history is very problematic. It was actually developed by a statistician to look at things on a population level, not individually, and it was never meant to be used individually, but that statistician also inspired eugenicists, which if you're not familiar with eugenics, they're the type of folks who say, you know, like certain people shouldn't have kids, we should like breed people of color and other folks out. So yeah, very problematic. We shouldn't necessarily be using it, and yet you'll hear BMI referenced quite a bit still in the eating disorder literature. In terms of the compensatory behaviors, after a binge, they will engage in these behaviors, again, vomiting. And as I mentioned, I was going to talk about this. Vomiting fails to prevent the absorption of about half the calories absorbed during a binge. So if you eat 5,000 calories and you vomit, you are probably still retaining 2,500 calories, right? People will try to do things like eat what they call a marker food first, like something like spinach. So like when they throw up spinach, they know they're done. What's the problem with that? What happens to food once it gets into our stomach? Yeah, it churns around, right? So it's not, I mean, not that I'm saying people should vomit harder, obviously, but like, it's just not effective as people think it is. And you're obviously damaging your teeth, your throat, things along those lines. It also, vomiting affects your ability to feel satiated. So the more you throw up when you don't have to, it's gonna skew your hunger and your sense of satiety. There are other potential dangers with this as well. This might have been when some of you were very little, so I don't know if people remember this case, but in the sort of aughts, mid-aughts, there was this famous case of a woman named Terri Schiavo who was brain dead, but they were keeping her like not on a breathing tube, but with a feeding tube. Like for some reason she could breathe on her own, but not eat on her own. And it was like a big national case because her family was like, she had a DNR, we want to take her off. And other people were like, no, that's cruel and unusual. And like the president got involved. It was big deal. Well, what got kind of lost in the messaging of that is that Terri Schiavo had her stroke that left her in a vegetative state while she was purging. She had bulimia nervosa. So again, if you're putting a lot of stress on your body, you can have unintended consequences. Laxatives and diuretics also almost completely fail to reduce the number of calories consumed. And compensatory behaviors may temporarily relieve the negative feelings attached to binge eating, but over time, very similar to OCD, right? This cycle forms where it's like binge, purge, and it doesn't ever actually help. Fasting. My client that would eat full sticks of butter, she like it was a challenge to herself daily to see how far in the day she could go without eating. So she'd get up at like a normal time, 7 in the morning, and she wouldn't let herself eat until like 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So again, in addition to the emotion regulation, she was just hungry. Excessive exercise, these folks will do cardio for 6 hours at a time, right? This can happen with people with anorexia too. Very problematic. So some similarities here. Both of these disorders tend to onset after a period of dieting. And I had clients who were like, yeah, so I lost 5 pounds and people complimented me. And so I was like, well, what if I lost 10 pounds? What if I lost 20 pounds? And that unfortunately set them off on this path. This fear of becoming obese, again, even if they're currently underweight, the drive to be thin, a preoccupation with food, weight, and appearance, elevated risk of self-harm or attempts to die by suicide, feelings of anxiety, depression, perfectionism is a huge one. One of my lab mates studied perfectionism, and this is very linked to disordered eating behaviors. Substance abuse, particularly with bulimia, we see that, but with anorexia, you can see it as well. It just might differ in the types of substances. So people who binge eat might also binge drink. But people with anorexia, for example, might abuse things that suppress your appetites, like nicotine or, again, diet pills. And really disturbed attitudes towards eating. One of the biggest things in therapy you try to do is change that and get them to think of food as fuel again. And that's really hard for them because they see food as the enemy. In terms of differences, people with bulimia tend to be more worried about pleasing others, being attractive to others, and having intimate relationships. With anorexia, it's almost like they get so far in themselves, they don't. So Portia de Rossi, who's an actress who was on Arrested Development and is married to Ellen DeGeneres, she wrote an autobiography about her time with anorexia nervosa. And she got to the point where everyone around her was like, you're too thin. And it wasn't about pleasing them. It was like, to her, she still felt like she was big. People with bulimia tend to be more sexually experienced. They display fewer of the obsessive qualities that drive the restricting anorexia in particular. People with bulimia tend to have histories of mood swings, low frustration tolerance, and poor coping. And in fact, bulimia tends to be comorbid with things like bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. People with bulimia are more driven by, controlled by emotion. And people with bulimia are more likely to display characteristics of a personality disorder. And only about half of women who are not on the pill will lose their periods versus, again, all women pretty much with AN. And again, we see a lot of damage caused by purging. One of my clients had never had a cavity in her life, and I believe had 3 or 4. The next dentist appointment she went to after she started purging. And there are tales of people getting, ulcers in their esophagus, or even on the finger they use to help themselves vomit, developing sores there. Now, binge eating disorder is really interesting to me because I was in grad school from 2004 to 2010. And the entire time I was in grad school, we were diagnosing people with binge eating disorder. We knew it was a thing, had been being researched since the 90s. And we knew that this was something that we saw in our clients. Back then it was like a disorder for further study in the back of the DSM. And then in 2013, it was moved from that section to the main text of the DSM. And you would have thought that like the DSM somehow allowed people to go around stabbing people with like how offended people were by making binge eating disorder a disorder. They were like, oh, we're just giving people an excuse to overeat, blah, 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 blah. Like, no, it's not that. So this is basically all the symptoms of bulimia without the purge. But it has the same pathology where you'll have these recurrent episodes of binge eating at least once a week for at least 3 months. And I really wish actually they put this with the bulimia diagnosis as well. I really like how they broke down binging here. So you have to have 3 or more of these symptoms. So eating really quickly, eating a large amount of foods without physical hunger, eating till you feel uncomfortably full or sometimes past that, eating alone because of embarrassment, and then feelings of disgust, depression, or severe guilt. So again, I feel like we should copy paste this into the bulimia diagnosis because this is similar for them. They have distress regarding their binge eating, but no compensatory behavior. But they will also experience distortions of their body, similar to people with anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. So rates are really interesting. So if you just look at sort of the whole population, we tend to see this is pretty low, 1 to 2% of people. But when you start to look at specific clinical samples, we see differences. So about 15% of people who are involved in Jenny Craig, which is a weight loss program, have binge eating disorder. 30% of people who go to university research-based weight loss clinics. People who join Overeaters Anonymous, 70% of them. Okay, so let me type in Overeaters Anonymous because it's problematic in its own way. So OA tries to model itself on the like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous model, but that's an abstention model, right? So the whole point of AA or NA is you don't use drugs, you don't use alcohol, right? But we need to eat, right? We've established that. So instead what they do is they drastically reduce or restrict things you're not allowed to have any complex carbohydrates, things along those lines. And so, obviously we see some pathology related to that. Now, really interestingly, again, the common dialogue is 90% of people with eating disorders are women, right? Only 60% here are female, 40% are men. Men get this disorder much more frequently than the others. We also see an older age here. So for anorexia nervosa, onset is typically in their teenage years, bulimia, maybe teen years into college years. The average age of a client with binge eating disorder is 40. So this is affecting people who are much older. And as I mentioned, they share these similar concerns about shape and weight. Okay, so we know these are problematic. We know they are scary. We know they are damaging people's bodies. Why do they happen, right? How do people get going down these spirals? And this is where most of my research focuses, is on risk factors for disordered eating, but also potential protective factors. How can we stop disordered eating before it starts? So most theorists are going to subscribe to a multidimensional risk perspective, and that's certainly the mode I take. So we know that the more factors you have, the greater risk, just like anything else. Sociocultural conditions can include societal pressures, family pressures, psychological problems. If you already have a mood disturbance, right? Something like binging and purging might really feed into that. And then biological factors. Cynthia Bullock out of University of North Carolina has spent, probably the past 8 years or so doing a really extensive, she was going to start, I think, with like 2,000 people, and now she has 20,000 people in this data set, genetic study of anorexia nervosa, figuring out what are the genes that are causing this. And so we know that's in play as well. Where I tend to focus my research, just because it's of most interest to me, and in my opinion, one of the most problematic issues, is on societal pressures. So many theorists believe that particularly Western standards of female attractiveness and Now the increasing pressure on people of any gender identity to conform to certain body types have contributed to the rise of eating disorders. And standards have changed throughout history towards a thinner ideal, although how curvy or not that ideal is does fluctuate. And so Miss America contestants, for example, they did this research through the 90s, declined in weight by about a quarter pound a year. Winners declined by more. And then Playboy centerfolds actually got thinner as well. So this is that data, actually it was through the 80s that they looked at it. And you can see how drastically some of these things dropped. I wonder if there was some sort of backlash after the initial data was examined, because you see that Miss America went back up a little. And then this was the Playboy Playmates. And again, I think some of how the measurements kind of went back up is in the 90s, it became much more popular to have like breast enhancements, for example. Obviously, this has permeated our culture. We all know this. This is one of my favorite memes ever, because, you know, if a cat meme can acknowledge the body image is a problem and media is a problem, then we know it is. I also, one of my friends pointed out, like, it's a blonde, blue-eyed cat on the cover of the book. And I put this up before we got Simba, and now it relates even more because I have a big orange boy myself. So, but we know that there are differences, and I'm going to get to men as well. But just sort of starting with women, there are drastic differences in terms of what is presented for a model and what the average person looks like. So the average model is about 5'9" and 110 pounds. Again, even though I hate BMI, I think here it's a quick reference, 16.3, whereas the average woman is my height, much lower weight than me, but still higher, right? 142 pounds. So somewhere around 24.3 for the BMI. Now the cutoff for being a healthy BMI is 25. The reason I put that in air quotes is because in the 90s, before the 90s, it used to be like 28 or 28 and a half. And then I forget which governmental entity it was. It was the National Institutes of Health or something along those lines, decided that was too hard for people to remember. And so they just arbitrarily made it 25. And so all these people who had been normal weight woke up overweight just for like convenience. So that's the reason I put healthy weight in air quotes. We know that we get societal pressures from lots of different places, right? So the media, Barbie from a very young age, although I want to fully acknowledge that Mattel did put out a more diverse range of Barbie body types a couple years ago. And then we saw these Dove ads and other ads using more diverse bodies. The problem with some of these ads is that they're like, look at us celebrating body diversity. And then the text on this ad reads, curvy thighs, bigger bums, or under stomachs. What better way to test our firming range? So this is a firming skin cream. So it's not saying, just let your body be. It's saying, this is for fat people, right? I mean, and there's also obviously a lot of backlash whenever you have more diverse ads, because our society has been used to seeing people portrayed a certain way, and when they're not, some people get offended by it. All right, so Barbie, and again, I had Barbies growing up. People have already given my daughter Barbies. Okay, you know, she in and of herself is not problematic, right? But we just need to acknowledge how unrealistic she is. So the average woman, as I said, is about 5'4", somewhere around 140, 149 pounds. They wear about a size 14. They're about a B cup. Their waist is 30 to 34 inches. Their hips are 40 to 42. And their shoe size is, I wear 9, so right around my shoe size. Barbie would be 7'2", which I think is like Shaquille O'Neal height, right? But she'd only weigh 101 pounds. I've calculated that BMI once. It scared me too much. I blocked it, and I don't ever want to look it up again. It's really scary and low, right? She'd wear about a size 4, and I think the only reason she'd be a size 4, not lower, is to accommodate her breasts. Her breast would be at FS. Her waist is the same circumference as her head. A lot of Disney princesses are the same, by the way. Her hips would only be 33 inches and her shoe size would be a 5. And this is also hilarious to me, to imagine Shaquille O'Neal walking around on a women's size 5 shoe, right? Like, what? So Barbie's body would only have room for about half a liver and only a few inches of intestines, as opposed to the usual 26 feet. The result would be chronic diarrhea and death from malabsorption and malnutrition. Her neck is twice as long as the average human, which would make it difficult for her to hold her head up. Her legs are 50% longer than her arms, whereas the average person's legs are only 20% longer than their arms. And she would not have enough body fat to menstruate and therefore would not be able to reproduce. And she'd also be unable to walk upright. She'd have to crawl around on all fours because her feet are so small and she's so top heavy. So again, is Barbie in and of herself horrible? No. Should we talk to our kids about how this is unrealistic? Probably. I think the ideal of Barbie is great. So I don't know if anyone knows the backstory of Barbie, but like before Barbie, girls only had baby dolls. So it was like, you have to be a mom. And the people who created Barbie were like, let's create a doll that can have careers and give girls like that to look up for. But the problem was they based her on a sex doll. So, you know, that's where things kind of went south. As I mentioned, unfortunately, men are not free from this. There's this great quote from Jean Kilbourne, who's done a lot of research about the impact of ads over the years. She has a documentary as her presentation she calls Killing Us Softly, that talks about the influence of ads. And she has this great quote where she says, this is not the equality I was striving for, right? To have men also have problematic things to do with their body. And so men can and do get the traditional eating disorders. I want to emphasize that. But what we see more often in men is what took us a while to give a diagnostic term to. So for a while, they called this bigorexia or muscle dysphoric disorder, muscle dysmorphia, reverse anorexia. And now what it is it's technically a specifier for body dysmorphic disorder. So it's BDD with muscle dysmorphia. And so the individual is preoccupied with the idea that their body build is too small and insufficiently muscular. And the reason I'm using the they pronoun here is that women can also get this version of BDD, although it's much more common in men. This will be associated with some really problematic things. Steroid usage. If it's unregulated, if it's not monitored, steroids can cause many of the same problems we see in people with eating disorders, heart attacks, gross things too. Like if you've ever watched like documentaries where bodybuilders talk about this, if you use too many steroids, your muscles can grow faster than your ligaments and tendons can keep up with. And so what can happen is like maybe this ligament or tendon will snap and then your bicep will like roll up. It's horrifying. Like if you have a weak stomach, don't Google it. But if you don't and you're interested, so yeah, you want to be careful about stuff like that. There's horror stories of kids as young as 5th grade getting steroids from their coaches. Excessive exercise and excessive weightlifting. Again, if you're exercising to exercise, awesome. But if you're over exercising or obligatory exercising or spending 12 hours a day in the gym and that's getting in the way of you doing your work, right? Then it becomes problematic. They'll also have very similar body dissatisfaction to people with the traditional eating disorders, where instead of looking at themselves and thinking they're bigger than they are, they'll look at themselves and think they're smaller than they are. So checking their appearance 12 times a day in the mirror, being on a really strict diet, comparing themselves with other men. So this is like an interesting sort of BDD eating disorder combo. But I had a friend in grad school who treated a man who was like obsessed with eating healthy. This is sometimes called orthorexia. It's not an official diagnosis, but it's like taking eating healthy to the extreme. And so the only thing he'd eat every day, his entire diet consisted of chicken, and like those microwave steam fresh vegetables. That was like all he would eat every day. And then he'd be on his elliptical for like 4 hours, right? Or be lifting. Not healthy. And in fact, he was one of the few patients we saw that ended up having to be hospitalized because he got his weight too low. So this can be scary. And even if they're not to the point of using steroids, very similar to diet pills, muscle building things, creatine are not regulated by the FDA because they're supplements. And so not all, but some of those have junk in them you shouldn't take. And so I know when I was in high school in the 90s, there were these horror stories of kids who took ephedrine and they were like high school basketball players and died of heart attacks because of it. We see this again all over with toys. So these are the Star Wars action figures from the 70s and 80s when the movies first came out. This is when they were re-released at the end of the 90s. Mark Hamill, who plays Luke Skywalker, said, looks like somebody gave me steroids. So again, this ideal changing of what you're supposed to look like. And you can see this very clearly in G.I. Joe. He really started as just like an average Joe. And then, you know, we get these extremes, right? That are impossible to reach. And so we know that on top of these pressures that all people of all genders face, certain groups are at even greater pressure. So we know models, actors, dancers, certain athletes. Even before I get into the stats on here, actors have talked about developing eating disorders from losing and gaining weight for roles. If you think about Christian Bale in The Machinist, how thin he had to get. And I know Tom Hanks has said that he developed type 2 diabetes from losing and gaining weight so quickly for his roles. And so, you know, this affects actors of all genders. But athletes, so this was, I think, a study done in the early 2000s. 9% of college athletes met criteria for an eating disorder, another 50% had symptoms. And again, this is both genders. I think they left maybe 6 years ago or so now, but I was friends with the prior cross-country coaches, and they told me they were a married couple, and they told me they had more male athletes than female athletes who developed eating disorders over the years. That's a sport that really like emphasizes a lean body shape. In particular, we see gymnasts, professional dancers, divers, although some of this has changed. So like gymnasts in the 90s, ice skaters in the 90s, for example, there was actually a whole book about this called Little Girls in Pretty Boxes, about how there was like this very svelte aesthetic. And then if you look at gymnasts today, like if you look at Simone Biles, like she's built like a Mack truck, just a 4'8" Mack truck, right? And so you have, I think, that changing because of the level of skills that they're doing. But that doesn't mean some people still don't suffer from eating disorders. Professional ballet dancers in particular, it's quite high. So between 7 and 38% of female ballet dancers have eating problems. Up to 15% of ballet students who are like training, that's what their job is to become a professional, may be truly anorexic. And so, yeah.
This was me thinking about like wrestling and men and wrestling and how their eating habits are very interesting, especially when they have to leave the weight.
Yeah. So, okay, this is good point. So one of my good friends in grad school, and actually we're collaborating on a different project right now, Brian Carazia, great research on men's body image. He was a wrestler in undergrad, and so he was sort of interested in that phenomenon. And yeah, it's essentially sanctioned bulimia, right? Because they will do all kinds of purging behaviors, you know, run with trash bags on, sit in the sauna, what have you, to try to make weight. And then once they weigh in, they'll go and actually eat food, so like binge, so they have energy. Although I heard that some wrestling places are doing it right before to try to avoid some of that, but I just wonder if that leads to more people passing out. I don't know. But yeah, boxers, jockeys, Lauren Hildebrand's book, Seabiscuit, talks about, you know, the horse, but also about what the jockeys went through to try to make weight. So like they couldn't afford a sauna, so really gross. Sorry, today's like a gross day. They would wrap themselves in like tarps and sit in the manure pile. It's like homemade sauna. Manure is poop, by the way, if people are familiar. So yeah, there are definitely sports that essentially the sport encourages this, right? And that's very problematic. Yeah.
Have you seen the, like, weights, like, I think like muscle building competitions or like society sanctions?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, yeah. The like Mr. America muscle, yep, yeah. Because a lot of those folks do use steroids, and you know, you can get really muscular in healthy ways, but the way those folks do it usually isn't, unfortunately, right? So yeah, we do see that with some of those muscles. Like if you look at an Olympic weightlifter, right, they don't look like a bodybuilder. Right, Olympic weightlifters are actually usually like we would think they look chubby, right? But it's just because they have muscle, but also a little bit of fat around there. They don't look like the triangle shape, right? With all the rippling muscles. So yeah, I would say definitely there as well. One of the things I was going to say with the jockey real quick before I forget too, is the irony is like Seabiscuit's jockey would lose all this weight, and then they'd be like, "Oh no, Seabiscuit's too good. We got a handicap in." And like put 40 pounds of weight in the saddle. Just like this poor kid, right? But yeah, so there are sports that sanction it, and then there are sports that just sort of like have a look, and people believe that to get to that look, they have to eat in a very unhealthy ways, right? And again, some of that has been changing. So like during my lifetime, for example, they've stopped showing female athletes' weights. They used to show those like when they were talking about Olympic gymnasts. They'd be like, this person's 98 pounds. And then they stopped doing that. But they still do it for men, which like problematic, right? So it's sort of interesting to think about. All right, so when I was in undergrad, I did a whole project about ballet and eating disorders. And I have these really cool images that I pulled over for this lecture just so that I think it's so fascinating. So these are ballet dancers in the 1800s, and what you can see is that they are sort of looking like average people, right? Like they're not super duper skinny. They're certainly not obese, but you know, they seem pretty healthy, probably. You know, maybe more of an hourglass shape. And this is in the 1800s. And this was called like the era of the sylph. And really interestingly, this started even then, that like ballerinas would be portrayed as sort of these lighter than air entities. And then like, this is what they actually looked like. They actually looked like, again, healthy people. And then in the 30s, we saw more of this like athletic build. And I think you still see this in a lot of like modern and jazz and lyrical dancers. And then we saw in the 70s this really thin, Gelsey Kirkland was a principal ballerina for the American Ballet Theater. I read her 2 autobiographies, and she talked about like, not only not eating, but like taking cocaine so that she didn't eat. And like, that's how she'd fuel herself for her performances. Obviously not healthy, right? And like this bottom picture is when she was like, look, I got so much healthier. And I looked at it and I went like, oh, your perception is still so skewed, right? Like if you look at her arms, they don't necessarily look healthy. This was one of Gelsey Kirkland's role models. One of the things that gets me in this picture is her pointe shoes too big for her foot. As a former dancer myself, that's actually dangerous on top of everything else. And you'll see this in younger dancers. And then this is an image I pulled in, I believe, 2004 from the American Ballet Theater's website. It'd be interesting to go and look at it again now. But you can see every rib right here, right? And I remember I did a research project after that about dancers and body image. In our department, I had to all sort of vet your proposal. And this professor I'd never had for class, we had about 10 professors on our faculty. It was like, well, don't ballerinas just have to be thin? And like, I'm trying to articulate something that's like no, you jackass. And one of my professors just leaned over and was like, no. Professor Payne, she was our cognitivist. She wasn't even like my eating disorder professor. So, and in fact, it's really interesting. So again, I danced growing up. I was like one of those dance mom kids, and I was in the Nutcracker occasionally. And when I was in the Nutcracker, my dad would help move sets around. And he said one day he was just like chatting with one of the male ballerinas, and he was like, how do you get those women up in the air? And like, you are so strong. And the guy's like, she doesn't jump, she's not going up, she does most of the work. And so like, again, thinking about how muscular you have to be for that, right? And we know that these pressures start really young. So this is a study that 2 of my undergrad professors and 2 of their students did. So Mernon and Smolak were 2 of my professors. In fact, Smolak was my undergrad advisor. And they took elementary school kids 1st through 5th grade, and they showed them pictures of celebrities. And so this was like late 90s, early 2000s. So the celebrities were like Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. And actually at that point, they couldn't find like body emphasizing pictures of male celebrities. So they had to use male models, which again, partially could affect the result of this, which they acknowledged. And they said, what would you have to do to look like this? And the boys were really jokey. They're like, oh, you'd have to lift a house. There's no way you could look like that. And the girls again, 1st through 5th grade said, you'd have to not eat, or you'd have to eat and throw up. So kids that young know that this is what you'd have to do. And in reaction to this, I used to have a picture of it. I guess I there it is. Yay! The authors actually wrote a book for children called Shapesville. And this is actually now, I did a like parenting class for how to raise your kids body positive, which you might think like, Dr. Myers, why did you have to do that? Just because I researched it doesn't mean I know how to communicate it to my own child, right? And Shapesville was a big part of what they recommended. So I thought that was so cool. And it's just a really cute book where each character is a different shape and each character has different talent, and no one judges anybody based on and they're all like very active. So it emphasizes being healthy. It's great. All right. And so we know that there are these societal pressures. And we do see prevalence rates that are different for economic and racial differences. And in the past, again, as I mentioned, we tend to think of these as like Caucasian women, white teenage girls. But what we've discovered in the past like 20 years, I would say, is that it's high among people of all socioeconomic status. It's high among people of all ethnicities and races. And in fact, some of the newest cutting edge research that's come out in the past couple of years has been about disordered eating behaviors in people with food insecurity. So folks who have to visit food banks and things like that. And a lot of them will engage in like binging behavior or hoarding the food, things along those lines. And so, I mean, we see, and again, I love these women. I want to admire these women. But when you have people like Beyonce and Shakira up as like what Latinx or African-American women should look like, right? It's not realistic any more than Barbie is realistic for white women, right? Or Christina Aguilera for that matter. And so the idea is that everyone's seeing their own race and again, their own gender, because we see this much more with men. We did a follow-up to the Mernon Smolak Milton Goods study while I was an undergrad, so just a few years later, and we could find pictures of guys being objectified, being sexualized, right? So that changed pretty quickly. So everybody's getting these messages. This is what you're supposed to look like, and you just can, when it's not realistic for all body types and all people's health, to be perfectly honest. There's also a socially accepted prejudice against overweight people. So one of the populations I worked with when I was in grad school were people who were going to undergo bariatric surgery. So what used to be called stomach stapling, it's now called gastric banding, gastric bypass, gastric sleeve. And the amount of prejudice those folks had experienced was horrifying. To like waitresses telling them, I'm going to just bring you a diet soda. Or you don't need to order dessert. People yelling things at them on the street. right? And because of that, and because people think they're like helping people by yelling things like that, this adds to the fear and preoccupation about weight. So we see a lot of young girls are currently dieting, and dieting has been sometimes termed America's national pastime, and that the idea of losing weight, particularly for women, being nothing short of a cultural obsession. Obsession with fat as a national pastime, and perhaps one of the most apt descriptions. Like, I cannot remember where I read this to this day, and it bothers me so much because I'd love to give this person credit. But that they described America as a bikini store next to a McDonald's, right? That like we have these two diametrically opposed ideas of like, you should be really slim, but also there's a proliferation of unhealthy foods available. And again, not that it's a bad thing to eat at McDonald's sometime, right? But also like, let's make fruits and vegetables more easily accessible for people in food deserts. I don't know. That might be crazy talk. Hey, thank you. And this is perfect. We're talking about eating disorders, so it's okay to get Girl Scout cookies. Thanks, Audrey. So you know, we have messed up ideas about food, and that unfortunately affects some people's bodies. So we'll pick up here and keep talking about eating disorders and particularly how to treat them on Thursday.